Welcome to Control Alt DAO, a podcast where we explore the convergence of leadership, martial arts, mindfulness, and talk about ways to navigate gracefully in this time of uncertainty and rapid change for our planet. I'm your host, John Laux. Let's get started. Welcome, friends. Welcome to our second episode of Control Alt DAO. I am your host, John, and I'm really excited to get into today's episode. These are some of the themes that I've most wanted to explore behind the idea for this podcast. The themes being, I guess, what I'll call leadership lessons from the martial arts. And I think it'll be important as we get into that to talk about what we mean by leadership, because it actually is a pretty broad definition the way that I think about it. But before we do, I just think it might be useful to spend a few minutes on what the martial arts have meant to me, where I'm coming from, how I've thought about those things. I took my first Taekwondo class when I was 7. And so martial arts have been, in one form or another, a presence in much of my life, and something that I've come back to repeatedly over time. And each time that I've come back to some kind of training after, a couple of years of not doing something, it's really felt like coming home again in a certain way. So Taekwondo as a kid, grew up around the Karate Kid movies and the Ninja Turtles, but Taekwondo was real, and I trained for a good 4 or 5 years. Did get a black belt when I was in, I want to say 6th grade, age 12, something like that. That kind of fizzled out as I got into middle school. In high school, I was on the fencing team. I explored that, which is a more Western modality. But some of those themes from youth stuck with me when I got into college. And I liked the aspect of discipline from the martial arts. And even though it wasn't necessarily a part of my training as a child, I liked that this was kind of more mythic and image than, actual experience at that point. But I had that sense of the martial arts master or the Zen master, calm under pressure, just gracefully navigating situations in life. And that appealed to me. And it was one of the threads that led to, in my second year of college, kind of a big exploration of meditation, martial arts, yoga. I tried a bunch of things during that period of time. And two of the ones that stuck with me for periods of time were Aikido and Tai Chi. Really, really enjoyed those. Went hard at Aikido the last 2 years I was in college, and a little bit after that. And Tai Chi started and then stopped and picked it up again. But Tai Chi's actually been largely a through line through most of my life since then, more than half of my life. Mostly Yang style, a little bit of Wu with Yang style, some of the Ching Men Ching, the short form, the 37 movement form, as well as a bit with the longer form, the full 108. So that's been a through line. And so I've been drawn more to I would say, the more yin arts or the more fluid arts, less of the striking arts since my late teens. Not completely though. There were some years where I trained in boxing, which was a very interesting and different departure. I was doing that as part of a men's group that I was in. And I think if Tai Chi often is very soft in its approach, boxing was the opposite. And so it was novel, and it was helpful to get a different sense of that. I loved the workouts. I continued training in boxing for some years after I finished fighting. So learned a lot from that too. And anyway, when we moved to Asheville a couple of years ago, I was originally looking for a Tai Chi school and just couldn't find anything that really worked. It seems like where we live, everything that I found for Tai Chi, either the classes were at what for our family is considered dinner time, or they were at 10 or 11 in the morning on like a Tuesday. So I really don't know who Asheville's trying to attract for their Tai Chi classes, but apparently it's not working parents. So I had to let that go. But after a period of time, again, felt the urge to get into something. And I did a real quest, I'll say, which was helpful for me. I think often in the past, I'll find something that I'm drawn to, and then I just get into it. And again, in human design, I'm a generator. So once I'm into something, I just keep going, and I keep going. And sometimes I keep going at the things that aren't necessarily great for me. And so it was helpful this time to I thought of it almost like dating, to purposefully date different schools and, martial arts lineages, and look for things that would stick with me and that I could see. And I wanted something that had the softness elements in it, that also had hardness, that I could see myself cultivating for a number of years, and also a sense of like friendship and community that I could build over time. And the thing that I found was Wing Chun in the Moyat Muay Tung lineage. So I've been training in Wing Chun for a couple of years now, and it's just been awesome. It really has checked all those boxes. I love that it is partner work. There are single forms. There are forms that you can do on your own, which are a super important element to the system. But a lot of it is, drills that are done with a partner. I think compared to something like Tai Chi, where so much of the emphasis, at least where I've trained over the years, has been on just memorizing and doing different forms. We learn so much when we work in relationship with other people. If I'm touching hands with somebody else, I'm constantly getting feedback on, am I centered? Am I off balance? Where am I relaxed? Where am I tense? Where are they tense? Where are they relaxed? Can I feel them? How much of them can I feel through their hands? That to me is very interesting. I love that the forms themselves can also work on their own independently. If I'm traveling, I can do them in a hotel room or the workout space at the gym. Don't need a lot of equipment. Anyway, there's a lot I love about Wing Chun. You'll hear that as I get into the descriptions. But what I wanted to explore for the body of this podcast is 5 lessons that can apply in a leadership context, in a relationship context, in an organizational context that I associate with the martial arts training that I've done. And so before we get into the lessons themselves, I think, a word or two on leadership specifically. So a lot of us think of leadership as something that happens in organizations, something that leaders do in organizations. And in that context, leadership is generally understood to mean something maybe similar to management. It's an org chart based thing. It's a hierarchical based thing. It's a role dependent thing. If I am your manager, then I am a leader, that kind of a thing. And that's not how I see it. The definition of leadership that I worked with when I did a lot of my training was that leadership is our capacity to influence the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. So if you break that down, the thoughts, what people think, the feelings, how people feel about a situation or about me or you, and the actions, things that they do on the basis of those things. So that's what leadership is. It's a very existential definition, actually. And so one of the insights that we tended to work with is that from that perspective, we're all leaders and we're all leading all the time. The question then is, what are we leading toward? What are you leading toward? Are you leading toward disharmony and dysfunction and ego and fiefdoms and things of that nature? Are you leading toward cohesion and alignment and brainstorming and new possibilities and results and getting things done? Lots of possibilities in all those respects, but it's a very widely applicable definition of leadership. And so that's the context in which I'm speaking about it in this conversation. It can apply to how we are working in teams, working with neighbors or interacting with neighbors. It can apply to how we are with family members, volunteering, even to how you relate to yourself. So that is That's how I'm thinking about it. So, without further ado, the 5 martial arts lessons related to leadership. Number 1, yin and yang. Develop a sense for when to lead and when to follow, or when to assert and when to yield. So this comes mainly from Tai Chi, thinking about the rollback exercise, the push hands exercises. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate in organizations is many people have agendas at the same time. It's understandable. If you're in a meeting with 12 people, there's at least 12 agendas probably that folks are bringing into the room. And part of the skill in an organizational setting or in a complex relational setting is to allow for those different agendas to coexist and to harmonize. Not always easy. There's skill in navigating that in terms of how an agenda unfolds and whose needs get met when and where and so forth. But there's care that can go into that. And so a situation that came to mind as I was thinking about it is, this is some years back. I was part of a team and I was consulting for a client. And in this particular encounter, this was the final presentation where my company, I think it was 4 of us, were presenting to the stakeholders at the client's organization, including the person that I will call the sponsor, who brought us in to do the work, and about 12 people who were his peers as well as his bosses within the organization. And that's an important aspect of how this situation unfolded. So the sponsor was seen as the subject matter expert within his company related to the things that we were consulting on, which had to do with cyber risk and different things of that nature at the time. But we were hired in to provide additional perspective and to bring a distinct and thoughtful lens on top of the work that he was doing for them. And so we were, 15 or 20 minutes into the presentation. I had set context. I was facilitating a lot of the dialogue. And at one point he asked a question. And he asked a question of, how we were thinking about a particular issue or whether we were taking a particular factor into account. And I could feel as he was asking the question that there was a certain tone of him wanting to sound informed, knowledgeable, and smart and competent about it. I don't think he was necessarily doing it from ego, but I could feel that kind of underlying urge in how he was presenting it. He needed to be seen as the credentialed subject matter expert in front of his peer and management group. And so, I could have shut him down. I could have said, no, it's a dumb question or something. Or, hey, I'll get to that later or whatever. It was, the timing was good for the question. But I did consider it kind of we'll call it maybe a yellow belt level question. It did not necessarily have the depth that I think our team brought to the situation. And so it was, but I could just see it, and I felt that push hands kind of quality kick in that interaction, where instead of pushing back, I just yielded and I let him go. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What do you have in mind when you say that? Tell me more, essentially. And he just talked and he brainstormed and he got his thought out, which took him maybe 45 seconds or so, just to kind of empty his tank of what was behind the thought and what he needed to express at that point in time. And I heard it and I understood a little more contextually, and his points weren't, in any way wrong, but they weren't like the whole picture that we were bringing to the task. And so then after he finished, then I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's part of what we do, and here's what we do with that, beyond that. And so I was able to maintain my position as the facilitator in the group and the subject matter expert who they had hired to come in to do the job, while acknowledging the rightness of his position to the extent that it felt right, and without negating anything he said, but to put it in a broader context and to redirect a little bit where appropriate. that struck me as a very interesting encounter in terms of where, you don't have to be wrong for me to be right. We can both be right in our respective ways and feel like we've each done our part and accomplished our objectives accordingly. Okay, lesson number 2: don't beat the system, pet it. This is something that I'm almost verbatim taking from one of my Aikido instructors back in the day. It always stuck with me. We were sitting in the quads on our campus at the time, and he said something to the effect of, well, a lot of people try to beat the system. I don't beat it, I pet it. And I think he was referring to something about healthcare or like benefits that were available to him that he figured he might as well take advantage of at the time. It just stuck with me. I remember him really fondly. He seemed a bit like Uncle Iroh from Avatar: The Last Airbender in hindsight. But this notion of how do we relate to systems? A lot of people do try to beat systems, or they resist systems and fight them. And there's a place for that if the system is corrupt or off base in some way, if there's wrongs that need to be spoken of and communicated. But most of the time, that's not how systems are. Systems just kind of suck. They are what they are, healthcare in the US. My God, is it broken? But I'm not going to put my energy into trying to change that. That's not my karma in this life. So how do we relate to most systems? Do you fight it, or do you allow it and accept it and work with it to the extent that it has gifts that it is able to bestow on you? And that's, I think, the essence of what he was getting at the time. It has some of the quality of, when Ray Dalio talks about accepting reality and deal with it, it has some of that. But we can accept reality. The dealing with it, we have a choice. Again, it can be resisting, or it can be yielding and allowing and looking creatively at it, which is, to me, what he was pointing at those years back. There's things we can change, there's things we can't change, and there's things we can work with in that. So an example that comes to mind of this has nothing to do with the day job necessarily, is my wife and I were going to visit her parents a couple of years back. And a few days before the trip, my wife had a couple of, she's a coach, and she needed to see a couple clients on Zoom during the time we were there that she couldn't move. And so she sent her mom a note saying, hey, these are my constraints. These are the times I'll be blocked while we're visiting. But other than that, I'm free. And if she had sent that note to my parents, they would have said, cool, good to know. We'll work around that. That's not how my mother-in-law, that's not how she interpreted it. She's a projector in human design, and which has been a very helpful thing for me to understand about her. She likes to feel included, and invited in, and that relational quality is very important to her. And so instead of hearing that message as, hey, I'm available except at these times, she heard it as, you're not important to me and I don't want to spend time with you. I'm spending my time doing these other things. And she responded accordingly and, let us know that she wasn't too thrilled about those constraints and things. And, okay, stop, course correct, pause. Like, let's look at, okay, hang on. let's have a redo. And, there was a certain amount of tension that I think we might have felt going into the trip around, just awkwardness around who pays for groceries and meals and things of that nature. And then, the questions around time. And I noticing all the interactions that, we had with my wife's parents over the years, often we brought this subtle tension in of like these unstated rules that we just hadn't navigated. And so then there was always this sort of disharmony, this undercurrent throughout the exchanges of like, well, okay, who's going to pick up the bill for this thing or whatever. But it was never stated explicitly. And so just recognizing, hey, like, they are who they are. We love them. We want to have a nice experience with them. Like, can we do this differently? And so we adapted and said, hey, great, let's send a redo. And, my wife reached out, had a different communication. Hey, looking forward to seeing you. These are the things that I'm excited to do and that were ways that we're looking forward to spending time together. Let's go to the beach. They live down in Florida. Let's play some games. Let's, do different things. And, we laid out an agenda, and it didn't change the fact that she had constraints, but it was speaking into a vision instead of like away from relationship in that way. And that was particular to that situation, but it was just recognizing the dynamics. And then again, what I coached my wife to do, and what we did was we just put everything on the table. When we first got there, hey, how would you like to pay for groceries? Do you want us to take turns when we pick things up, or do you want to just split everything in half? How would you like to do restaurants? And just anything that we had concerns about, we just named up front and dealt with it. And it was the most delightful, easeful trip in that regard. There was no tension. So just the fact of recognizing what was so and putting it out there and working with it made it such a different experience than it otherwise could have been. And we had a great time. So that stands out to me as an example of like accepting the system and petting it, working with it, working with what's available. Another one that I might mention, this is more in a work context, is just to recognize that we are in systems. I mean, we're deeply in systems. But I tend to think about this in a work context, in the sense that when someone's being a jerk to me, I sincerely believe most people are trying to do their best and do right by the people around them. So when someone is being a jerk, unless that is just how they are always and all the time, I have to think about who's being a jerk to them, or like what are they on the receiving end of that they are just sort of downstream then to me or to us. I think about it often. There's that scene in, I think it's the second Matrix movie, where Keanu's back in the Matrix, and whoever I think he's in a like kind of a concrete central plaza of some urban setting, and every character starts turning into Agent Smith. And I think about that often in organizations, that when we're talking to somebody, they'll be themselves to a certain extent, but then something triggers, and all of a sudden, like, they turn into the Matrix, they turn into the company line, they turn into a constraint or something that they are being held to do and managed to. And they stop responding freely as an independent human being. You can feel the tonality of what their restrictions are or constrictions are in the conversation that follows. And I think just having that awareness allows me to take things less personally and respond in a kinder way to people who aren't necessarily responding kindly to me. Like, they're probably stressed. There's probably a lot of stuff they're working with that I don't have to hear about, and I probably don't want to hear about. But it at least allows me to recognize that if I can have an easeful and positive interaction with them, I'm probably helping make their day better, in addition to enjoying that interaction more myself. All right, lesson number 3, training to fight versus training to win. Now, this is a lesson that does come from boxing for me. And I did not have an outstanding career as a boxer. I had 5 fights. I did win my last fight. I'm proud of that one. And it was the process of training for that last fight that instilled this lesson for me. For the first couple of years that I was training in boxing and actually training to get in the ring and fight, I think I was just happy that I could get in shape to do that. The cardio's intense, the strength training's intense. The interval training, you get nauseous. It's a lot of work to do that. It feels great too. The workouts are awesome. But I thought that was enough to be in shape to be able to go 3 rounds of, let's say, 2 minutes each, against an opponent, and give it my all for those 3 rounds. That last fight was different. And I worked with a different coach, and he helped me in addition to the physical training, which he had his own style, but boxing training is boxing training. But he had a whole mental lens and strategic lens that he brought to it. He knew the opponent I was going to be fighting. He was a little shorter than me, a little heavier than me. So I had the reach, but he had the weight. So, him crowding me was probably going to be one of his tactics. And so how to use the reach and how to, if I got stuck on the ropes or in a corner, how to throw a combination and pivot and step away and get into open space again and continue being able to operate. And at a certain point, I remember him saying, like, make this your mantra, like, picture this happening, picture being in the ring and doing these moves, like, make that a loop that you play. And it really helped me to see, like, how to intend forward into situations like that in terms of how I want to act rather than leaving things just to chance, to actually like make that clip real so that when I was actually in the ring and I got cornered and I adapted and moved out, I was just fulfilling the image that I had already trained my brain to expect and to respond to. It was a powerful lesson, and I highlight it here in terms of like an organizational context because one of the biggest weaknesses that I often see in organizations is lack of follow through. Particularly for early career people, but certainly not limited to that. Just doing what you say you're going to do. And also just seeing that there's a job that's bigger than just what, you in your function are being asked. We build technical solutions for our clients, and I can give you a bunch of math and say that that's the answer, or I can do the math and then I can be very curious about how is this going to land for the person who's receiving it, and how do we connect those dots, and how do I frame it in language that they're going to understand, and how do I present it to them with the right visuals or the right slide format, to facilitate the way that decisions are made in their organization. All of that is part of it. It's not just training to, in that sense, training to hand a deliverable off, but really trying to train to make somebody very successful, to really be of service in an interaction to a client of mine. And in the process, we also then are successful, but it's a win-win in that respect. I think this is attributed to Stephen Covey, and we talk about IQ, intellectual, mental intelligence. We talk about EQ, emotional intelligence, but we can also talk about XQ, the execution quotient. Do you have that instinct to get things done, that bias toward action? And I continue to see a lot of people just don't have that, and I think it's trainable. But it is something that often needs to be spelled out for many folks to see a job through. And that isn't everybody's strength, but it is something that it can be trained. And I think we're better off for it. An example that comes to mind, actually for the same client that I mentioned in the earlier example, different example, we were invited to compete in an RFP to win their business on a different project. And this was related to, this was for a U.S.-based insurance company, and we were invited to help them understand their strategy for risk management and reinsurance for their cyber insurance program. That was what we helped with, and that's what we were being asked to compete on. And I think often in corporate settings, we think that growth is the main goal. Hey, we're going to help you grow in this area. And that's understandable. A lot of our clients did want to grow during that period and find ways to do it profitably. But I was curious about them. And one of the things that I did during the RFP was do some research. And I read some of the earnings calls and the investor presentations that their company had put out. And it was very interesting seeing their CEO and some of their executives talking about their growth strategy as a firm at large. And it was a company that, as many property casualty insurance companies, they write a lot of homeowners, they write a lot of auto business. They have small businesses that they insure for a variety of things. And cyber insurance was just a very small part of that picture. And I started developing this hunch that cyber meant something different to them than it did to many of our clients, and that we might have wanted it to mean to them. And so we had a call with the client during the RFP where we got to ask some clarifying questions. And after some of the initial questions, I just said, hey, I just want to run something by you, make sure I'm understanding this right. And I played back to them the general hunch that I had, which was their reasons for being in the cyber insurance space were really defensive much more than they were offensive. This was a company that was very good at making money, insuring individuals and Main Street America businesses. Cyber was a departure. It's a niche area. It's a very new area, still being tested in a lot of ways. And I just said, my instinct was they needed to be in it because they wanted to stay relevant, and they didn't want someone else, a different competitor, to come in and offer a product that they didn't and then risk losing the business. And I laid this out kind of as the thesis that I was working on. And he just said right away, he's like, yeah, that's our goal. Don't upset the apple cart. The company was really good at making money. They wanted to do enough in cyber to keep doing that other thing well, not to make cyber the thing that they did well. And it so crystallized how to go about responding to the RFP. And so we wrote a very different RFP response than we would have for a growth-oriented client or prospect. And we won the account in that respect. And it was just such a good example of really looking at what the client cared about and seeing it through to ensure that what we had to say mattered to them. Lesson number 4, finding center in yourself and others. So center is a concept or a principle, you could say, that's common to many of the martial arts and the meditation arts. I'm going to explore this one from a few different angles. So in Tai Chi, there's the principle of working with the Dantian, building your center, relaxing into the belly, things that work with that, and also not losing your center in that regard, like having that be a place that one comes to dwell and rest and relax. I remember a humbling moment when my daughter was a couple of weeks old, and she was a couple of weeks old. She was hungry, and we were up late, and I was tired, and she was crying about something, and we weren't quite sure which of the 4 needs it probably was at that point in time. And I was just stressed and frazzled, and I had a little hissy fit, and I blew up about something, and my wife and I cleaned it up a bit later, but it was not my finest moment. And I realized that to say it one way, I had let my daughter take my center. Of course, she didn't do anything on purpose. She was just being her, perfectly being a 3-week-old human. It was more that I had given her my center, really. And so one of the elements that stands out to me of this is, the negative way to say it is, don't be a victim. But that really isn't necessarily all that helpful. When I am centered, I approach my days with much more sense of agency, brightness, creativity. It's one of the reasons why I meditate almost every morning before doing much else. And when I don't, I notice it. I feel the difference. I'm not as buoyant. I'm not as bright. And that I do practices that help me maintain that state of awareness and disposition throughout the day as much as I can. So we all get knocked off center over time. But one of the things that I think both meditation and any kind of serious physical training, but I put martial arts up there, can help us to refine center again, because we all get knocked off, but building that window of tolerance so that we can dwell in a centered place more and more of the time. Another aspect of it is drawing someone's center out. Again, in a Tai Chi context, It's one of the things that often happens in a push hands interaction. I'm wrist to wrist with somebody, and we're moving and we're shifting weight, and okay, where are you? It's kind of trying to feel into where their center is. And in an organizational context, one of the best ways I think to do that is very simply to ask some questions. Our minds are so good at trying to make meaning out of things, but we're not always great at doing it. That's why projection and transference are very real concepts in psychology. So it's better not to guess. It's better to stick to things that we can objectively see and explore, and to kind of uncover what's so together in an interaction. A few years ago, I was working on a pretty high stakes project internally at my company, and my manager was part of it as well. We needed to present some things to our board of directors, and normally I'm given a lot of autonomy in how I go about doing things that I'm part of. I'm really good at what I do, and I have a lot of perspective on it. And this was a rare case where, as I was presenting ideas about how to approach the problem, the subject matter we were asked about, that my manager kept shooting me down. He'd say, "No, we can't do it that way. We have to do it this way." And that happened like 3 or 4 times over maybe a 3-week period, where I said, "Hey, we don't have a good story in this way, or we don't have this information. Here's what we can do." And essentially I got the answer, "No, that's not good enough. Do something different." Make this other story work. And it really was starting to grate on me. Because that's, first of all, it's just not the most motivating thing to hear, but it's also just not how I operate. I felt like I was being asked to look for a story that wasn't there. And, that felt out of integrity for me at the time. Now, in fairness to my manager, he talked to the board much more than I do. And, so I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt in that regard. But it was still pretty demotivating at the time. And so we got through the project, and that last day and a half, I was really kind of stewing on all this. And I was really worked up about it. And I was prepared to go into the meeting, and talk with him and kind of in a huff and lay out my grievances and tell him what I wasn't okay with and everything. And I got into the meeting, and what I actually said, just right out the gate, was, "How do you feel like this all worked out?" And I'm so glad that I asked him a question rather than come in with all of that gruff frustration that I had built up, because it allowed him to get present. And I learned, yes, he does know the board much better than I do. And he knows the style of presentation, and he had particular dynamics that he had not stated explicitly in prior conversations, but there were particular things he wanted to make sure happened. And that was part of what he was going for. Okay, cool. And, he had his own, I'm sure both sides of the interaction could have been communicated a little better at different points, but it allowed me to get present with him. I found his center when I asked that question. I knew what was important to him. And in doing so, it saved me from, again, kind of in a push hands example, like pushing hard in a place that frankly wasn't that important to him, and creating a lot of drama and resentment along the way. So I'm grateful for that. There is another way to think about center, and this is more of the Wing Chun element of it, which is much of the Wing Chun system is oriented towards center line. If we think about the body, most of the parts of our body that we want to protect, the head, the face, the jaw, the throat, the heart, the genitals, like they're all on the central line of our bodies. So we want to protect center line. And that's also in an aggressive or a self-defense context. We also want to attack center line for the opponent. It's the fastest way to get to the things that are going to make a difference in a violent encounter. And so much of Wing Chun is oriented around center line, building strength on center, forging strength on center. And in an organizational context, what I have found to be really insightful is to look for center line in interactions. And one way I think about center line simply is that in an organization, the center line is truth. Truth is the unassailable position in nearly all situations. If I am speaking truth, you cannot argue with me. But we have to be careful there about what is truth, really. Because if I assert something that I can't back up, it's not necessarily truth, right? It comes across as an opinion. If I put out a judgment, that's not truth. Hey, why are you being an asshole? That's not truth. There's a judgment in there. But if I say, hey, I noticed your tone changed there. What was that? That is pretty objective. And when I stick to what's objective, it's hard to argue with. So we look for truth in organizational settings. What's interesting, though, is that there are truths and there are truths. We talked about in the leadership training that I've done, we talked about the truth of your experience to your highest vision. And so that could be a very personal thing, a way of saying it. So in a meeting or an interaction, truth could just be the facts, but often it's, hey, this is what I see here. And because I'm saying this is what I see here, whatever follows that statement, it's just my truth. It is irrefutable. It is my truth. I might be wrong, and I speak from the place of having the humility to recognize that I might be wrong. But I am putting my truth in that moment out into the conversation. And then when I finish saying whatever I'm saying, then it's, what do you guys think? Am I off here or am I onto something? And then other people can add to it and say, actually, no, like there's this other thing, or yeah, that's it. And so truths can meet one another and interact in that way. And I think it's interesting, like a good truth can transcend and include other truths to give more context to recognize a bigger game that's at stake. So an example of that I was really proud of at the time, one of my team members had taken a new job, and so we had a position to fill. And at the time, the company I was working for had some budget constraints that we were under. And so we were watching the expenses on replacement hires. And, our company had, the role would have been easiest to fill in the United States. We also have offices in London, which would have been also easy, a little less so, but still pretty workable. We also have an office in Estonia, and we have great colleagues in Estonia. But Estonia is a small country and it's a small labor market, and it was a very niche role that we were looking for. But because of exchange rates, Estonia is more cost effective for us as a company. And so the head of HR had said, you can replace this role with somebody in Estonia. And I remember when he said that, I just thought, oh shit, like this is not going to work very well. And so we were good sports about it. We put out the rec, and we had one of our recruiters start looking around, and we talked to 5 or 6 candidates, and just none of them really were particularly what we were looking for. And I just realized there's a bigger game here. And so I sent a note to our head of HR, and I said, hey, I know it is super important for you that before the end of the year, we manage our expenses and that we don't overspend on anything, but including, employee salaries, which is a big number for us. I get that, and I want to see us succeed in that too. And, not but, and there's a bigger game that we are playing. My team needs to build the next version of our flagship product in the next 6 months. And I think this happened it was November at the time, I want to say, which pretty much means as we go into the new year, I need this role filled, which means I have a month to fill this role. As long as I stay within budget, why does it matter where this person is hired? Is it okay to also open this role and recruit in London or in the UK and in the US. And I sent him that note, and he basically said, yeah, stay within budget. But it was like, it was such a perfect example of we confuse what's really going on with the surface. What was true for him was needing to manage budget. What he put out was a requirement to only hire in Estonia. And essentially, I wouldn't say I called his bluff, but I challenged him on that. And we got to what was really essential. And I shared what was really essential for me. I need my team positions filled so we can do the other important work of our company. We don't exist just to manage expenses. We exist to make great products for our customers. And so both things could be true at the same time. Lesson number 5, relax harder. This is another Wing Chun lesson that we talk about a lot in our school. And it's one of the things that really drew me to Wing Chun. As I said earlier on, it's finding the yin within the yang and that ability to maintain ease through what can be a very intense form of training at times. Boxing workouts are great in a way. It's that high intensity interval kind of environment. But yeah, sport fighting trains us to go really hard for short bursts. And that's useful, but for me, that's not as applicable to life. Life tends to be slowly and persistently grinding us down from a certain point of view. It's the cancer diagnosis that my wife's been navigating and that our family's been going through for the last couple of years. It's a work challenge where a great employee leaves and we have to rebuild a team, an experience that maybe I'll share more about in another episode. It's the challenges of life, and so I think about this as the ability to relax through pressure. So often when we think about relaxing, what do marketers tell us? Relaxing is, you should be at the beach, treat yourself, go get a massage, go buy a bottle of vodka, like whatever the absurd messages are that we get in the consumer world that we live in. But if we can relax through the situations that are normally or formerly stressing us and challenging us, that is freaking powerful. And so how do we do that? Again, meditation, martial arts, I think like one of the core things that they do is allow us to go into stressful situations and remain calm, to find and keep our center again, right? A few years ago, I wouldn't call it martial arts, but I was very into Wim Hof method for a couple of years' time. The really intense breathing, the cold showers, the ice baths. And I'll tell you, like, when I first went into an ice bath, the guy who was coaching me through it said, don't try to think your way out of this. Like, it will be painful. Like, it will be intense. This is not going to be, it's not a walk in the park. You can't think you can't rationalize that. You can't rationalize your way out of that. But to get into an ice bath, gritting through it and like toughening and groaning and like all that stuff is just going to make the suffering worse. It just makes it horrible. But what I've learned to do is, like, when you get in, everything the body might register as pain, just let it be seen and experienced as sensation. And that discomfort becomes fucking ecstatic. It is unbelievable. And that is a lesson I've seen not only in the ice baths, but in really hard kung fu conditioning that I've been doing, and really in the intensity of the life situations that I found myself in, where I could just like pause for a moment in the midst of it and go, oh my God, like this is wild. And be able to see beauty and profundity even in what might otherwise be seen as a really shit situation. And so this like consistent, gradual ability to keep cultivating relaxation in a widening array of situations and at increasing levels of pressure is one of the things that I have found very, very helpful from a lot of my training. And I emphasize this because a lot of people just don't do that. Life in America today is, our attention spans are short. There's, a quick, pithy, tweet length answer for many things, and I think because of the internet in part, like people just think that we should be able to become experts in things quickly. And I think we've lost that sense of hard work and what can come from it. I work for an organization where, we move fast and there's a lot that we are trying to get done. And I've had multiple employees over the years get cold feet at different points and decide that they want to leave. And, if someone gets a great job offer that like makes sense for them and it's a natural, next step in their career progression, I'm excited for them and I want to cheer them on. And often they become my clients out of that. And that's awesome too. But I've seen several people where that really was not the case. Essentially, they got nervous about some aspect of our business. Again, startup work does not feel the same as a big organization. And I think there's a perception often that a big organization means safety. And, I just don't think that's true. I was just reading today, Microsoft recently laid off 15,000 people and, organizations don't come much bigger than Microsoft. So how safe are you really? I think is one of these questions. That's another level of reality testing for all of us to do, I think. But, I made this offer to several employees of, hey, you're in a good position here. You are part of the team that is building the core intellectual property of this company. And there are very few people in the industry who do what we do well. And you're a journeyman at this stage. You're not the master yet. I'm pretty good at what I do. Work with me for another 6 months. Let's hash this out together. Let me coach you. Let me help you build the skills that are going to make you more effective in situations at the kinds of organizations that our clients work at. And if you still want a new job in 6 months, I will open doors for you and I will help you get 5 job offers, not just the one that you happened to get. I think that's a good offer. And I've had several people not take me up on that. And, their circumstances are their circumstances. But I think a lot of it is that, we think we're behaving rationally, but we really make decisions emotionally, largely speaking. And when somebody can't take that pressure, feels like there's something where they're insecure or not stable, or there's something that just feels more attractive to them, I think their critical functions shut down. And I've seen it happen. And so again, to be able to relax through what might on the surface feel like a deeply unsettled situation is an incredible power. And that's beyond any technique. It's really training our nervous system through whether it's martial arts, coaching, other kinds of leadership training, meditation, things like that. But I think it's one of the superpowers that we have as human beings to be able to really do good work and to take on the kinds of challenges that life keeps throwing at us. So that is the 5th and final lesson from this episode. I hope you've gotten some insight out of this. I've enjoyed it and looking forward to next time. Thanks so much.